Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. We hear that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is stuck in the mud. Is it true? And what could be done about it, even if it were? In this election year, these questions have sent politicians and professors on the warpath. Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Gary Burtless, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, James Heckman of the University of Chicago, Timothy Smeeding, Director of Maxwell's Center for Policy Research at Syracuse University, and Ken Deavers, Chief Economist at the Employment Policy Foundation. The topic before this House, insights on income. This week on Think Tank. Today, politicians from both sides of the aisle are competing over who can best improve the economic lot of the poor and the middle class.
Yes, these are the best of times for many who work on Wall Street. But the facts leave no doubt that they're also the worst of times for many who live and work on Main Street.
Middle class values, strong families and faith, safe streets, secure futures. These things are very much threatened today. Threatened by 20 years of stagnant incomes, of harder work by good Americans for the same or lower pay, of increasing inequality of incomes, and increasing insecurity in jobs and retirement and health care.
Sounds serious, but is there a real problem, or is this just the stuff election years are made of? Let's look at the numbers. We hear that the richest 5% have seen their share of national income grow by a third since 1973, while the poorest Americans have lost a third. We shall see about that. Further, the case is made that since the early 1970s, wages have leveled off and probably dropped. But hold on, that's just cash wages. Total compensation, which counts benefits like health insurance and pensions, has gone up. And now look at this. Consumer spending is going way up, which means that there is more going on than meets the eye. The good news is we have four eminent economists who claim to understand what these data mean. The bad news is that they don't agree. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. What I want to do is take two specific topics, income trends and income inequality trends. And I want to talk first about income inequality and start with you, Tim Smeeding, and then let's go around the room. Is income inequality increasing?
Yes, income inequality has increased in the United States over the past 20 years, although less in expansions like the current one than in recessions.
Gary Burtless?
It is, and I think it's a matter of social concern because the growing inequality is a combination of an increased income at the top and shrinking incomes at the bottom. And it's the shrinking incomes at the bottom that I think are the biggest source of concern.
All right, Jim Heckman?
Certainly income inequality has increased, but I think the real question is what is wage inequality doing, and also what is consumption inequality doing? They're very different measures, and I think they have very different lessons for discussion.
Ken Deavers, is income inequality increasing?
Yeah, I don't think there's any disagreement among the economists on this panel over that. I think the real issue is what's happening at the bottom. That to the extent that incomes are falling for people at the bottom, that's an issue that we ought to pay some attention to.
But I mean, Gary Burtless said that income for poor people is diminishing. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that your view is that it is not diminishing, but that the incomes of wealthy people are growing faster than the incomes of poor people, so that poor people absolutely are doing a little bit better, although relatively the income inequality, the gap, is widening. Is that your view?
Well, not exactly. What I would say is that sort of what we've seen is an increase in income absolutely for people at the top. A decline in the middle class, which is what sort of is wrapped up in this debate as well.
But not in the shares.
No.
Go ahead.
That's right. There's a decline in the middle class share of total income. if you define it, for example, around median incomes.
Right.
But most of the people who left the middle class defined that way moved into higher income, not into lower income. And so the issue sort of is why are we having this sort of spreading out? Why are we having a hollowing out in the income distribution? Is it because most people are becoming poor?
About 2/3 of the shrinkage in the middle class, at least through the 80s, was people getting richer, but the other third is something of concern. Depending on exactly the years and the measure of income, somewhere between 25 and 35% of Americans have lower real incomes now than they had 15 years ago.
All right, I want to put one other chart on, and this deals with income mobility, and it talks about 2 years, 1975 and 1990, and it shows that the people who were poor in 1975, in the poorest quintile, 5% have remained in the poorest quintile, 15% have moved to the second quintile, 21% to the third quintile, 30% to the fourth, and 29% to the fifth, which would seem to tell us that there is a great deal of income mobility. And when we are talking about the poor in the United States, we are not talking about the same people year after year or decade over decade. Comments?
I think that this is an important issue. Mobility is certainly important in America. And one of the consequences that you would normally ask is inequality increasing, is mobility also increasing, in which case we might tolerate a higher level of inequality. But this study, I think, is flawed.
This is by the University of Michigan.
The data is from the University of Michigan. The study was from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. There have been at least 3 other studies that have used this data more appropriately, I believe, and which have found that there's really been no change in mobility out of the bottom quintile through the 70s.
No,
as compared to the 80s.
but there can be no change, and yet it could adhere to a traditional American curve of substantial upward movement. So it doesn't change that slope.
The other studies do
exactly
show
right.
mobility.
Absolutely.
They do show
Absolutely.
mobility, but not at this rapid a rate.
Not at this rapid rate. What this, the average income of the bottom 20% here is $1,500 in 1975. So it's
mainly people who aren't in the workplace.
Right. It's paper boys and people who aren't in the workplace.
College
And college students. And 15 years later, they're making $25,000.
You mentioned that even the other studies, that all studies show that there is an appreciable amount of upward income mobility. These magnitudes may be wrong. Can anybody here give us a sense of what the appropriate magnitudes are?
Yeah. If you're looking at people in their 20s and you say, what is the chance that over the next 10 or 20 years they will see their incomes rise, the chances are better than 2 to 1 that they will see their incomes rise.
I mean, their quintiles rise. That they will go, that they will move up.
And their incomes
That'll
too.
put them in another
Their
quintile.
absolute incomes
That's right.
will rise.
Yeah.
As people age, as they acquire work experience and so forth,
And their real
incomes
incomes rise.
rise. That pattern still
The
remains.
difference is that the mobility hasn't changed in the past 20 years while inequality has increased.
And you're starting from a lower point. And so basically, even with the same transition process, you know, the destination is going to be at a different level than it was 20 years ago.
I want to put up 2 other charts quickly to try to understand some of the reasons why this income inequality exists. You see here that from 1970 to 1994, the percentage of female-headed households has more than doubled, from 12% to 25%. On the next chart, we see the family income differential between female parent households and married parent households. The female-headed household is earning about $17,000 a year. The married household is earning about $43,000 a year. Now, question, is a large part of this inequality driven by the substantial rise in the number of female-headed households?
Yes, without a doubt.
Yeah.
But we need to be careful here. Divorce is rampant in our society. It's grown over the last 20 years in all social classes.
And out of wedlock birth.
And out of wedlock births, although out of wedlock births are a lesser percentage of the numbers that you saw there than you might otherwise think. Over half of those single mothers who you saw there work, okay? In other words, don't get the picture in your mind that it's a teenage girl who hasn't finished high school who had a baby that we're looking at. We're looking mainly at divorced people.
Well, but those 1/3 of the out of wedlock birth mothers would more dramatically pull down that lower
They would.
quintile than the divorced woman who keeps on working.
Actually, there are three interesting characteristics about that lowest quintile. One is the rise of single female-headed families.
Yes.
Second is a decline in work effort among people who are in that quintile. There are now about 40% of the households in that quintile who report no work by any member of the quintile during the previous year. And the third piece is in a workforce which is paying higher and higher wages to good skills and high educations. That's where we have a large concentration of people who still have less than a high school education. So those things together pull that quintile to somewhat back, although it's not the principal cause. I mean, sort of growing wage inequality, and particularly falling wages for working males, is another significant part of what's going on.
Yeah, one thing you have to recognize about these family trends is that the growth in the number of single-parent families, the growth in out-of-wedlock childbearing really got going in the late 1950s. And from the late 50s through the mid-1970s, this trend proceeded, and yet income in the United States grew more equal. It didn't grow more unequal. So there were other factors that were strongly driving incomes closer together over that period. Since 1973, the factors have been widening incomes, and then you really get to see the influence of a growing number of low-income, one-parent families on the distribution. That trend is creating a lot of one-earner households trying to support kids, and those folks have never had a very good standard of living.
But that would, if we turn now to causation of this spreading apart of income, that would lead to a social causation rather than an economic causation. You can't say that foreign trade has increased divorce, I don't think.
Oh, you could say part of there's decline in the real wages of males especially. And you think about a marriage market, economists like to think of a marriage market. Although I agree with Gary that it's not the whole story by any means. That part of this rise in female-headed households is due in part to the declining real wages of low-skilled males who would be partners to some of these individuals.
Right.
And so I think you can't really isolate these two factors as cleanly as you're trying to do.
And the fact that the marriage market is also producing more assortive mating by education and skill class.
Right.
So the people
is producing what?
more assortive mating.
What does that mean?
Well, that means that you marry someone of your same socioeconomic class with the same goals,
Yeah, the correlation between husband and wife's education has risen over the last 20 years.
and the correlation between their incomes. So two MBAs, two lawyers versus two bricklayers, or a bricklayer in a
And that
in a
is
short
called
article.
assortive
mating.
mating.
And that's
Sounds
how
Mary
likes is another way of saying it.
in an economy.
Hey, this is a family hour show. No,
But
go
in
ahead.
an economy where most adults work, putting two good jobs together, these were the dinks, the double income, no kids, and you put two good incomes together with two good sets of benefits, two good degrees, good packages of skills, those people will move, those are the people who are moving from the middle up to the top.
right.
You put one mother there who's been divorced, let's say, who only has a high school degree, who had no real experience or not much experience before that, and you don't pay her child support or child care, you've got somebody who's in a really tough situation. And this isn't just true in the United States, this is true throughout Europe too.
Part of the issue that sort of, and gets back to some of Gary's work, that's what's been driving what's happening to low wages, sort of really comes down to sort of 3 or 4 issues. It is probably skill-biased technology is a significant part of it.
What does that mean? Skill-biased technology?
Technologies which are paying high rates of return to people who have very high skills.
High rates of return means high wages.
High wages.
High wages,
High wages, high incomes.
Substituting
Okay.
capital for labor.
Substituting.
Pardon me?
You're substituting capital, sort of.
ATMs.
Yeah, people who work
Right.
with more and more capital
Hold on.
equipment are earning high returns.
Substituting capital for labor,
Yeah.
automatic teller machines. Does that-
Instead of bank tellers, yes. For instance, automatic phone operating machines and automatic phone answering versus operators.
So the technology is driving out the semi-skilled worker.
The bank tellers of the 1980s and 1990s were the blacksmiths of the 1880s and the 1890s. Technology is driving away low-skill labor, replacing it with something that's cheaper, more productive, and more durable.
Let us move now from this idea of income inequality to what is happening to income trends generally in the United States. We put a chart up there. It shows that wages have diminished somewhat from 1960 to 1994. Compensation has gone up substantially, and consumption has gone up super substantially. Ken, why don't you why don't you explain each of those three things just as quickly as you can, and then let's see what we agree and disagree about.
I mean, what the wage line looks is cash wages.
Cash wages.
And cash wages, the real value of cash wages has certainly gone down since sometime in probably the early 70s, and the downward drift fairly constant.
Right.
If you include sort of non-cash payment parts of compensation, which have gone from roughly 20% of the total compensation of workers to over 40%.
And that includes?
Pensions and healthcare are probably the two biggest pieces of it.
Now, just explain to us what consumption means, and then let's write.
Okay. Consumption is a measure essentially of what people buy, both goods and services. And this is a measure of consumption per capita, per person. It's continued to rise rapidly. One of the reasons it's continued to rise rapidly is because of three things that have to do with women: increasing participation by women in the workforce, more hours by women in the workforce, and better pay for women.
There has been some study done on how vast or little the consumption inequalities actually increased. The evidence is that consumption is much less unequally distributed than income. Right? I think we would agree with that. And we'd also say there's some disagreement in the profession about whether or not inequality has been increasing dramatically or decreasing. How we measure in consumption.
We non-economists here, and there are many Americans who are not economists. They are all street corner economists. But we here talk about liberal economists and conservative economists. Would it be fair to say that one of the dividing lines between liberal economists and conservative economists are that conservative economists think things in recent years have been getting better, and liberal economists think they have either been getting worse, stayed the same, or not getting better as nearly as much as conservative economists?
There is a divide like that, but I think the most important distinction is probably what they think we should do about the trends.
Well, we're going to talk about that next.
I think most economists would agree that the wages offered in the labor market to low-skilled individuals have declined.
Absolutely.
And the recent cohorts, whether they're conservative or liberal.
Now in terms of this liberal-conservative divide, about whether things are getting better substantially or minimally or not at all, where would you four gentlemen position yourself?
I'd rather be non-dogmatic, which is what at least one major newspaper claimed that I was. I
you believe what you read in the press?
Sometimes.
That's like believing economists. I mean,
sometimes I just try and call them as I see them, as Yogi would say.
Oh my goodness.
Sometimes I think.
Let me ask another question. How would people in your trade characterize you?
Non-dogmatic.
Non-dogmatic. How about you, Gary Burtless?
Well, I think on average, the economy in the United States is improving, and it has improved over the last 20 years. I do think the distributional changes have been such that probably for Americans in the bottom third of the distribution, things have tended to get worse. And the further down you go, the closer you get to the very bottom of the income distribution, the faster they've gotten worse in absolute levels, measured in terms of income, wages, or consumption.
That's true.
Okay. Jim?
I think that there is a marked divergence between these different measures. And I think when we say things have gotten worse, they've gotten really bad in terms of earnings and not so bad in terms of consumption. But I agree, depending on the series, there's some marked downward decline. But it's not dramatic. It's not as precipitous as the decline in real earnings.
But any sort of a decline, or even the magicness of zero change, when the rest of the economy around you is growing and people are doing much better.
Problem.
Yes,
Ken,
it is.
You are in the declinist or the ascendant?
No, I guess I'm slightly more optimistic than Gary is. I mean, I think that overall the economy has gotten better for more than 2/3 of the people in the economy.
Okay, now we have to move on to our final topic, which is what do we do about it? There is this apparent problem of income inequality, and there is a division of opinion on how ascendant the general level of income is. Jim Heckman, I know you have attempted to assay and assess the various programs. What works, what doesn't work? Does anything work?
Well, I think the administration, and Gary Burtless says,
the Clinton administration.
The Clinton administration, and Gary Burtless in some of his writings, and many people have espoused the idea that we can actually use job training programs and substantial changes in education to provide an immediate remedy to the problem of at least the declining wages of the unskilled worker. We can, but at great cost, I think. And I think everyone would agree that the cost is substantial, even the cost to the government, if you take aside private costs of that activity. The logic is very simple. The price has gone down, but if we increase the quantity, the price of the unskilled labor.
Right.
But if we embody more skill in that individual moves out of that category, that's the theory, and that individual can escape the fate of the declining group. And there's a second kicker, which might kick in, which is that, in fact, if you remove unskilled workers, you might make them scarcer in the labor market and raise their incomes from that basis.
Do you think any programs that we now know of work?
Work in an immediate short-term sense, no. I don't think so. I think it's very costly.
I hope you would disagree. Okay.
I think it's very, very costly.
Okay.
But I think in terms of long-term educational responses, if we decided to have sort of a super Manhattan project, then of course I think we could send America to the schools, we could change the college graduation rate. But those are very, very costly programs we're talking about. And I don't think the political will is there. I don't think in an era of tight budgets.
Gary, does something work other than this
Well,
Manhattan project?
I don't think that the kinds of training and education programs that Jim described do provide any kind of an immediate response to this problem. No, they're not an immediate. They're not immediately going to change the income distribution in a way that favors people with limited skills or favors people with low incomes. Any effects they have are going to be cumulative. Anything you do about the schooling of people who are currently 12 to 18 years old is not going to have a major influence on the income distribution for 10 or 15 years. So it's folly to think that making these changes right now is going to have an effect within the next 5 or 10 years on the income distribution. Nonetheless, I think it's worth doing.
Tim, let Tim
I
in here, 'cause he
think
has a
the earned
problem.
income tax credit is an absolutely marvelous response, America's gift to the world of social welfare policy. America doesn't make many gifts as far as Europeans and others.
Earned income tax credit, EITC.
Yes,
explain
exactly. That means that if you go out and you work full time and you don't make enough money to support your family, the government subsidizes those wages through a tax refund.
It seems to me one of the questions is sort of in terms of what we now do with labor force training programs, skill upgrading. The really problematic issue isn't the 12 to 18-year-olds. It's the people who are 25 to 35 who are in the workforce who had dropped out of high school, who have terrible educations, and whether or not any intervention strategies for them are going to pay off either in the short term or even sort of in their longer term working careers. I mean, I think the real issue isn't sort of kids still in school where we could make the investment and where if we had the will, it would clearly pay 10 or 15 years out. The real question is sort of what about those folks who have lost out or are already in the workplace and who have terrible education?
Okay, all right. Let me just go around the room one more time and ask for a very, very terse, double-barreled answer about income trends and income inequality. Which way are they going?
Income inequality will remain high. I think we ought to compensate the losers, particularly those who behave in socially desirable ways such as working.
And income trends will?
Income trends will continue to grow, we hope.
Gary Burtless?
Overall incomes are improving, but they're falling down for people at the bottom of our distribution. I think we should do something about it, and in the long term that does mean making investments in improving their education, but in the short run I think improving the minimum wage, giving child health insurance to the kids of working age families.
Tax credit for children?
I do think it would be good to tilt the tax system more in favor of families that have youngsters. That's true, and I think that there are other things that we can immediately do to help the older folks, who cannot be helped by education.
Jim Heckman?
Right. I would agree that the wages of unskilled individuals have declined, but I also would like to make a point that we have a short-run problem and a long-run problem. In the short run, there are large groups of unskilled individuals who are very difficult to train and move out by any kind of job training strategy. In the long run, skill advancements, investments in the young, and investments in people who are worthy of the investment, for whom the investment does pay off, I think is a very sound strategy.
Ken Deavers, wither America on inequality and income.
But I mean, I think income trends are pretty strong overall for the economy. We do have, in fact, a large group that are being left behind. I think the earned income tax credit as a device that makes work pay, that supports socially desirable behavior, is something we ought to all be in favor of. And I think that investments in human capital, particularly in school youth.
Thank you. Ken Deavers, Tim Smeeding, Jim Heckman, and Gary Burtless. And thank you. Please send your comments or questions to New River Media 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can also be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.